CHAPTER 46 of the Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom, by Tobias Smollett. This recording is in the public domain. Influenced by this dire mistake, the breast of those unhappy lovers began to be invaded with the horrors of jealousy. The tender-hearted Monimia endeavoured to devour her griefs in silence. She in secret bemoaned her forlorn fate without ceasing. Her tears flowed without intermission from night to morn, and from morn to night. She sought not to know the object for which she was forsaken. She meant not to upbraid her undoer. Her aim was to find a sequestered corner, in which she could indulge her sorrow, where she could brood over the melancholy remembrance of her former felicity, where she could recollect those happy scenes she had enjoyed under the wings of her indulgent parents, where her whole life was a revolution of pleasures, and she was surrounded with affluence, pomp, and admiration, where she could, unmolested, dwell upon the wretched comparison between her past and present condition, and paint every circumstance of her misery in the most aggravating colours, that they might make the deeper impression upon her mind, and the more speedily contribute to that dissolution for which she ardently wished, as a total release from woe. Amidst these pinings, she began to loathe all sustenance. Her cheeks grew wan, her bright eyes lost their splendour, the roses vanished from her lips, and her delicate limbs could hardly support their burden. In a word, her sole consolation was limited to the prospect of depositing her sorrows in the grave, and her only wish was to procure a retreat in which she might wait with resignation for that happy period. Yet this melancholy comfort she could not obtain without the advice and mediation of Fathom, whom she therefore still continued to see and consult. While these consultations were held, Renaldo's bosom was ravaged with tempests of rage and distraction. He believed himself superseded in the affection of his mistress by some favoured rival, whose success rankled at his soul; and though he scarce durst communicate the suspicion to his own heart, his observation continually whispered to him that he was supplanted by his friend Fathom; for Monimia was totally detached from the conversation of every other man, and he had of late noted their intercourse with distempered eyes. These considerations sometimes transported him to such a degree of frenzy, that he was tempted to sacrifice them both as traitors to gratitude, friendship, and love. But such deliriums soon vanished before his honour and humanity. He would not allow himself to think amiss of Ferdinand, until some undoubted mark of his guilt should appear; and this was so far from being the case, that hitherto there was scarce a presumption. On the contrary, he said to himself, I am hourly receiving proofs of his sympathy and attachment, not but that he may be the innocent cause of my mishap. His superior qualifications may have attracted the eye, and engaged the heart of that inconstant fair, without his being sensible of the victory he has won; or, perhaps, shocked at the conquest he hath unwillingly made, he discourages her advances, tries to reason down her unjustifiable passion, and in the meantime conceals from me the particulars, out of regard to my happiness and quiet. Under cover of these favourable conjectures, our adventurer securely prosecuted his scheme upon the unfortunate Monimia. He dedicated himself wholly to her service and conversation, except at those times when his company was requested by Renaldo, who now very seldom exacted his attendance. In his ministry about the person of the beauteous orphan, this cunning incendiary mingled such awful regard, such melting compassion, as effectually screened him from the suspicion of treachery, while he widened the fatal breach between her and her lover by the most diabolical insinuations. He represented his friend as a voluptuary, who gratified his own appetite without the least regard to honour or conscience, and with a show of infinite reluctance imparted some anecdotes of his sensuality, which he had feigned for the purpose. Then he would exclaim in an affected transport, Gracious Heaven! Is it possible for any man who has the least title to perception or humanity to injure such innocence and perfection? For my own part, had I been so undeservedly happy, heaven and earth, forgive my transports, madam, I cannot help seeing and admiring such divine attractions. I cannot help resenting your wrongs. It is the cause of virtue I espouse. It ought to be the cause of every honest man." He had often repeated such apostrophes as these, which she ascribed to nothing else than sheer benevolence and virtuous indignation, and actually began to think he had made some impression upon her heart. Not that he now entertained the hope of an immediate triumph over her chastity. The more he contemplated her character, the more difficult the conquest seemed to be. He therefore altered his plan, and resolved to carry on his operations under the shelter of honourable proposals, foreseeing that a wife of her qualifications, if properly managed, would turn greatly to the account of the husband, or, if her virtues should prove refractory, that he could at any time rid himself of the encumbrance, by decamping without beat of drum, after he should be cloyed with possession. Elevated by these expectations, he one day, in the midst of a preconcerted rhapsody, importing that he could no longer conceal the fire that preyed upon his heart, threw himself on his knees before the lovely mourner, and imprinted a kiss on her fair hand. Though he did not presume to take this liberty till after such preparation as he thought had altogether extinguished her regard for Melvil, and paved the way for his own reception in room of that discarded lover, he had so far overshot his mark, that Monimia, instead of favouring his declaration, started up and retired in silence, her cheeks glowing with shame, and her eyes gleaming with indignation. Ferdinand no sooner recovered from the confusion produced by this unexpected repulse, than he saw the necessity of coming to a speedy determination, lest the offended fair one should appeal to Renaldo, in which case they might be mutually undeceived, to his utter shame and confusion. He therefore resolved to deprecate her anger by humble supplications, and by protesting that, whatever tortures he might suffer by suppressing his sentiments, she should never again be offended with a declaration of his passion. Having thus appeased the gentle Monimia, and discovered that, in spite of her resentment, his friend still kept possession of her heart, he determined to work an effectual separation, so that the young lady, being utterly deserted by Melvil, should be left altogether in his power. With this Christian intention, he began to sadden his visage with a double shade of pensive melancholy in the presence of Renaldo, to stifle a succession of involuntary sighs, to answer from the purpose, to be incoherent in his discourse, and, in a word, to act the part of a person wrapped up in sorrowful cogitation. Count Melvil, soon as he perceived these symptoms, very kindly inquired into the cause of them, and was not a little alarmed to hear the artful and evasive answers of Ferdinand, who, without disclosing the source of his disquiet, earnestly begged leave to retire into some other corner of the world. Roused by this entreaty, the Hungarian's jealousy awoke, and with violent agitation he exclaimed, "Then are my fears too true, my dear Fathom? I comprehend the meaning of your request. I have for some time perceived a host of horrors approaching from that quarter. I know your worth and honour. I depend upon your friendship, and conjure you, by all the ties of it, to free me at once from the most miserable suspense, by owning you have involuntarily captivated the heart of that unhappy maiden." To this solemn interrogation he made no reply, but shedding a flood of tears, of which he had already a magazine at command, he repeated his desire of withdrawing, and took God to witness, that what he proposed was solely for the quiet of his honoured patron and beloved friend. "Enough," cried the unfortunate Renaldo, "the measure of my woes is now filled up." So saying, he fell backwards in a swoon, from which he was with difficulty recovered to the sensation of the most exquisite torments. During this paroxysm, our adventurer nursed him with infinite care and tenderness. He exhorted him to summon all his fortitude to his assistance, to remember his forefathers, and exert himself in the imitation of their virtues, to fly from those bewitching charms which had enslaved his better part, to retrieve his peace of mind by reflecting on the inconstancy and ingratitude of woman, and amuse his imagination in the pursuit of honour and glory. After these admonitions, he abused his ears with a forged detail of the gradual advances made to him by Monimia, and the steps he had taken to discourage her addresses, and re-establish her virtue, poisoning the mind of that credulous youth to such a degree, that in all probability he would have put a fatal period to his own existence, had not Fathom found means to allay the rage of his ecstasy by the cunning arrangement of opposite considerations. He set his pride against his love. He opposed his resentment to his sorrow, and his ambition to his despair. Notwithstanding the balance of power so settled among these antagonists, so violent were the shocks of their successive conflicts, that his bosom fared like a wretched province, harassed, depopulated, and laid waste by two fierce contending armies. From this moment his life was nothing but an alternation of starts and reverses. He wept and raved by turns, according to the prevailing gust of passion. Food became a stranger to his lips, and sleep to his eyelids. He could not support the presence of Monimia. Her absence increased the torture of his pangs, and when he met her by accident, he started back with horror, like a traveller who chances to tread upon a snake. The poor afflicted orphan, worn to a shadow with self-consuming anguish, eager to find some lowly retreat where she could breathe out her soul in peace, and terrified at the frantic behaviour of Renaldo, communicated to Fathom her desire of removing, and begged that he would take a small picture of her father, decorate it with diamonds, and convert them into money for the expense of her subsistence. This was the last pledge of her family, which she had received from her mother, who had preserved it in the midst of numberless distresses, and no other species of misery, but that which she groaned under, could have prevailed upon the daughter to part with it. But exclusive of other motives, the very image itself, by recalling to her mind the honours of her name, upbraided her with living in dependence upon a man who had treated her with such indignity and ingratitude. Besides, she flattered herself with the hope that she would not long survive the loss of this testimonial. Our adventurer, with many professions of sorrow and mortification at his own want of capacity to prevent such an alienation, undertook to dispose of it to the best advantage, and provide her with a cheap and retired apartment, to which he would conduct her in safety, though at the hazard of his life. In the meantime, however, he repaired to his friend Renaldo, and after having admonished him to arm his soul with patience and philosophy, declared that Monimia's guilty passion for himself could no longer be kept within bounds; that she had conjured him, in the most pressing manner, to assist her in escaping from a house which she considered as the worst of dungeons, because she was in it daily exposed to the sight and company of a man whom she detested, and that she had bribed him to compliance with her request, not only with repeated promises of eternal love and submission, but also with the picture of her father set with diamonds, which she had hitherto reserved as the last and greatest testimony of her affection and esteem. With these words he presented the fatal pledge to the eyes of the astonished youth, upon whom it operated like the poisonous sight of the basilisk, for in an instant the whole passions of his soul were in the most violent agitation. "What!" cried he, in an ecstasy of rage, "is she so abandoned to perfidy, so lost to shame, so damned to constancy, to gratitude, and virtuous love, as to meditate the means of leaving me without decency, without remorse, to forsake me in my adversity, when my hapless fortune can no longer flatter the pride and vanity of her expectation? O woman, woman, woman! What simile shall I find to illustrate the character of the sex? But I will not have recourse to vain complaints and feeble exclamations. By heaven, she shall not escape, she shall not triumph in her levity, she shall not exult in my distress. No, I will rather sacrifice her to my just resentment, to the injured powers of love and friendship. I will act the avenging minister of heaven. I will mangle that fair bosom, which contains so false a heart. I will tear her to pieces, and scatter those beauteous limbs as prey to the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air." Fathom, who expected this storm, far from attempting to oppose its progress, waited with patience until its first violence was overblown; then, assuming an air of condolence, animated with that resolution which a friend ought to maintain on such occasions, "My dear Count," said he, "I am not at all surprised at your emotion, because I know what a heart susceptible as yours must feel from the apostasy of one who has reigned so long in the object of your love, admiration, and esteem. Your endeavours to drive her from your thoughts must create an agony much more severe than that which divorces the soul from the body. Nevertheless, I am so confident of your virtue and your manhood, as to foresee that you will allow the fair Monimia to execute that resolution which she hath so unwisely taken, to withdraw herself from your love and protection. Believe me, my best friend and benefactor, this is a step in consequence of which you will infallibly retrieve your peace of mind. It may cost you many bitter pangs, it may probe your wounds to the quick, but those pangs will be soothed by the gentle and salutary wing of time, and that probing will rouse you to a due sense of your own dignity and importance, which will enable you to convert your attention to objects far more worthy of your contemplation. All the hopes of happiness you had cherished in the possession of Monimia are now irrecoverably blasted. Her heart is now debased beneath your consideration. Her love is, without all doubt, extinguished, and her honour irretrievably lost; insomuch that, were she to profess sorrow for her indiscretion, and implore your forgiveness, with the most solemn promises of regarding you for the future with unalterable fidelity and affection, you ought not to restore her to that place in your heart which she hath so meanly forfeited, because you could not at the same time reinstate her in the possession of that delicate esteem, without which there is no harmony, no rapture, no true enjoyment in love. No, my dear Renaldo, expel the unworthy tenant from your bosom. Allow her to fill up the measure of her ingratitude by deserting her lover, friend, and benefactor. Your glory demands her dismission. The world will applaud your generosity, and your own heart approve of your conduct. So disencumbered, let us exert ourselves once more in promoting your departure from this island, that you may revisit your father's house, do justice to yourself and amiable sister, and take vengeance on the author of your wrongs. Then dedicate yourself to glory in imitation of your renowned ancestors, and flourish in the favour of your imperial patron." These remonstrances had such an effect upon the Hungarian, that his face was lighted up with a transient gleam of satisfaction. He embraced Ferdinand with great ardour, calling him his pride, his mentor, his good genius, and entreated him to gratify the inclination of that fickle creature so far as to convey her to another lodging without loss of time, while he would, by absenting himself, favour their retreat. Our hero, having obtained this permission, went immediately to the skirts of the town, where he had previously bespoke a small though neat apartment in the house of an old woman, widow of a French refugee. He had already reconnoitred the ground, by sounding his landlady, from whose poverty and complaisance he found reason to expect all sorts of freedom and opportunity for the accomplishment of his aim upon Monimia's person. The room being prepared for her reception, he returned to that disconsolate beauty, to whom he presented 10 guineas, which he pretended to have raised by pledging the pitcher, though he himself acted as the pawnbroker on this occasion for a very plain and obvious reason. The fair orphan was overjoyed to find her wish so speedily accomplished. She forthwith packed up her necessities in a trunk, and a hackney coach was called in the dusk of the evening, in which she embarked with her baggage and conductor. Yet she did not leave the habitation of Renaldo without regret. In the instant of parting, the idea of that unfortunate youth was associated with every well-known object that presented itself to her eyes, not as an inconstant, ungenerous, and perjured swain, but as the accomplished, the virtuous, the melting lover, who had captivated her virgin heart. As Fathom led her to the door, she was met by Renaldo's dog, which had long been her favourite, and the poor animal, fawning upon her as she passed, her heart was overwhelmed with such a gush of tenderness, that a flood of tears streamed down her cheeks, and she had well nigh sunk upon the floor. Ferdinand, considering this emotion as the last tribute she would pay to Renaldo, hurried her into the coach, where she soon recovered her composure, and in a little time he ushered her into the house of Madame la Mare, by whom she was received with great cordiality, and conducted to her apartment, with which she found no other fault than that of its being too good for one in her forlorn situation. Here, while the tear of gratitude started in either eye, she thanked our adventurer for his benevolence and kind concern, assuring him that she would not fail duly to beseech the Most High to shower down blessings upon him as the orphan's friend and protector. Fathom was not deficient in those expressions that were best adapted to her present turn of mind. He observed, that what he had done was in obedience to the dictates of common humanity, which would have prompted him to assist any fellow creature in distress; but her particular virtue and qualifications were such as challenged the utmost exertion of his faculties in her service. He said, that surely Heaven had not created such perfection in vain; that she was destined to receive, as well as to communicate, happiness; and that the Providence, which she so piously adored, would not fail, in due season, to raise her from distress and affliction to that honour and felicity for which she was certainly ordained. In the meantime, he entreated her to depend upon his service and fidelity; and the article of her board being settled, he left her to the company and consolation of her discreet hostess, who soon insinuated herself into the good opinion of her beauteous lodger. While our hero was employed in this transaction, Renaldo sallied forth in a sort of intoxication, which Fathom's admonitions had inspired, and, repairing to a certain noted coffee house, engaged at chess with an old French refugee, that his attention, by being otherwise employed, might not stray towards that fatal object which he ardently wished to forget. But, unluckily for him, he had scarce performed 3 moves of the game, when his ears were exposed to a dialogue between 2 young gentlemen, one of whom asked the other if he would go and see the Orphan acted at one of the theatres, observing, as a farther inducement, that the part of Monimia would be performed by a young gentlewoman, who had never appeared on the stage. At mention of that name, Renaldo started; for though it did not properly belong to his Orphan, it was the appellation by which she had been distinguished ever since her separation from her father's house, and therefore it recalled her to his imagination in the most interesting point of view. Though he endeavoured to expel the image by a closer application to his play, every now and then it intruded upon his fancy, and at each return made a stronger impression, so that he found himself in the situation of an unfortunate bark stranded upon some hidden rock, which, when the wind begins to blow, feels every succeeding wave more boisterous than the former, until, with irresistible fury, they surmount her deck, sweep everything before them, and dash her all to pieces. The refugee had observed his first emotion, which he attributed to an unforeseen advantage he himself had gained over the Hungarian; but seeing him in the sequel bite his lip, roll his eyes, groan, writhe his body, ejaculate incoherent curses, and neglect his game, the Huguenot concluded that he was mad, and, being seized with terror and dismay, got up and scampered off, without ceremony or hesitation. Melvil, thus left to the horrors of his own thought, which tortured him with the apprehension of losing Monimia for ever, could no longer combat that suggestion, but ran homewards with all the speed he could exert, in order to prevent her retreat. When he crossed the threshold, he was struck with such a damp of presaging fear, that he durst not in person approach her apartment, nor even, by questioning the servant, inform himself of the particulars he wanted to know. Yet, his suspense becoming more insupportable than his fear, he rushed from room to room in quest of that which was not to be found, and, seeing Monimia's chamber door open, entered the deserted temple in a state of distraction, calling aloud upon her name. All was silent, solitary, and woeful. "She is gone," he cried, shedding a flood of tears. "She is for ever lost, and all my hopes of happiness are fled." So saying, he sunk upon that couch on which Monimia had oft reposed, and abandoned himself to all the excess of grief and despondence. In this deplorable condition he was found by our adventurer, who gently chid him for his want of resolution, and again repelled his sorrow by arousing his resentment against the innocent cause of his disquiet, having beforehand forged the particulars of provocation. "Is it possible," said he, "that Renaldo can still retain the least sentiment of regard for a fickle woman, by whom he has been so ungratefully forsaken and so unjustly scorned? Is it possible he can be so disturbed by the loss of a creature who is herself lost to all virtue and decorum? Time and reflection, my worthy friend, will cure you of that inglorious malady; and the future misconduct of that imprudent damsel will doubtless contribute to the recovery of your peace. Her behaviour at leaving the house, where she had received so many marks of the most delicate affection, was in all respects so opposite to honour and decency, that I could scarce refrain from telling her I was shocked at her deportment, even while she loaded me with protestations of love. When a woman's heart is once depraved, she bids adieu to all restraint. She preserves no measures. It was not simply contempt which she expressed for Renaldo. She seems to resent his being able to live under her disdain, and that resentment stoops to objects unworthy of indignation. Even your dog was not exempted from the effects of her displeasure; for in her passage to the door she kicked the poor animal, as one of your dependents; and in our way to the apartment I had provided for her, she entertained me with a ludicrous comment upon the manner in which you first made her acquainted with your passion. All that modesty of carriage, all that chastity of conversation, all that dignity of grief which she knew so well how to affect, is now entirely laid aside; and when I quitted her, she seemed the most gay, giddy, and impertinent of her sex." "Gracious powers!" exclaimed Renaldo, starting from the couch, "I am under the delusion of a dream, or are these things really so, as my friend has represented them? Such a total and sudden degeneracy is amazing. It is monstrous and unnatural." "Such, my dear Count," replied our hero, "is the caprice of a female heart, fickle as the wind, uncertain as a calm at sea, fixed to no principle, but swayed by every fantastic gust of passion or of whim. Congratulate yourself, therefore, my friend, upon your happy deliverance from such a domestic plague, upon the voluntary exile of a traitor from your bosom. Recollect the dictates of your duty, and your discretion, and your glory, and think upon the honours and elevated enjoyment for which you are certainly ordained. To-night let us over a cheerful bottle anticipate your success, and to-morrow I will accompany you to the house of a usurer, who, I am informed, fears no risk, provided 20 per cent be given, and the borrower's life insured. Chapter 46.